Everyone, welcome back, and I'm sorry that it's been a while since I've uploaded. I've been working on a bit of field work and a few other things in life that's been taking up my time, but I'm really glad to come back, and it's actually also taken a long time for me to look up things related to Egypt for this level. There's actually probably a lot more to do in terms of identifying, but I figured I should try to just upload this because there is less revelation, which will be just an entire game of Egyptian iconography, imagery, art, references. So plenty of time to go back, review, see if I can find more as well. So in the Temple of Khamun level, with Khamun, I don't think I've ever really been able to find a name for it, a real life equivalent. But the Temple of Khamun, as it is in the game, begins with Lara riding her motorcycle right to this cliffside temple. And in some ways, it might resemble to people who are just in other cliffside sites, places like the Buddhas of Pamayan or Petra, that might remind you of that. And it sort of broadly kind of resembles that when you look at the cutscene. It resembles the Buddhas of Pamayan, sort of, but with like a little hole in the center, but neither of those sites are Egyptian. However, the closest equivalent, I guess you would say, is the Temple of Abu Simbel. This is a New Kingdom temple that famously was moved block by block and relocated during the flooding of the Aswan Dam, I believe, in Egypt. So building a dam, they had to flood the area. So they moved all of these blocks into the higher cliffside area. And yeah, you'll see, if you notice on the left-hand side, that's the more well-known facade of it. That's the facade of the Great Temple of Ramesses II, so Ramesses the Great. And also, but on the other hand, right next to his temple is the small temple to Hathor and Nefertari, which looks a lot more like the opening cutscene that you see in the Temple of Khamun. It fits the small temple to Hathor and Nefertari very well. It sort of, if you just focus on two main figures flanking the entrance. Going into the temple itself, it's very inundated with sand, and you have multiple sphinxes located in this area. I think the anniversary edition, they centralize it into one room, but here you have multiple different rooms with sphinxes in them. And the thing is, they're larger than any sphinx except maybe the Great Sphinx of Giza. It's really about the only comparable sphinx of this size. It's massive, but it's also made out of blocks, which is also unlike the actual Great Sphinx of Giza, which is actually a large natural rock formation that was carved into that. That said, there are larger sphinxes, just not on this scale. So, for example, there's one at the Louvre called the Sphinx of Tanis, and from the Temple of Amun as a cross comparison. Also, as you move forward, this is changed into more of a twin room, a big giant hallway in the anniversary edition. That's much more detailed. But here, when you go in here to this room, you see several different figures that also sort of resemble the outer facade of the Temple of Abu Simbel, the Temple of Ramesses II. Moving forwards, you go into this giant pillared space, and at first I thought it was just because of limitations that they had rectangular columns, but there are indeed rectangular pillars in Egyptian sites as well. And you can also see in the level design itself there are round pillars that they can make. These pillars are very odd because they have a lot of cartouches, so you see all the hieroglyphs with these the circles around them. They're all known as cartouches. If you're not familiar with Egyptian history or society, these are usually used for royal names. And I haven't really had the time to look up these cartouches, so at the end of all of this video, I will have a series of these put together. So if anybody's interested in spending an afternoon on a Sunday or something like that to try to look them up or match them, it'd be really fun to see what they are. And maybe later on one day I'll go back to matching them up. And also in the center you have this cat statue here, which will be present again in the anniversary edition as well. And it is actually a very famous cat from the British Museum, which I'll mention a little later. Here's some more images from this location. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. In this room you also have a lintel that has a combination of designs, I believe from at least two different sites. These are both recurring motifs that you do see in different architectural spaces. The Egyptians famously preferred to keep to a very strict, very formal, very rigid set of artistic conventions. There are changes, of course, if you're really into the art historical side of things, you'll probably be able to pick up little details and maybe nitpick that, of course. But overall, unlike many other societies for thousands of years, the Egyptians really kind of kept to recognizable static forms with some additions and changes. So one of these would be the winged solar orb, winged sun here with two array or snakes flanking the sides. And here's one example from the temple of from Dendera. And here at the bottom, you also flanking the winged sun in the game level in the lintel here. You have deities on both sides, and that's very similar to those at the Temple of Horus at Edfu. So there is actually real life analogs here that look very similar, not exactly the same. And this is something that I find that Tomb Raider has really kept to. The early Tomb Raiders here, and even the more recent ones, they've really used actual examples, and I really appreciate that. I was looking through, in the past few months, I was going over Uncharted Golden Abyss, the PS Vita one that not too many people have played. That one actually has a lot of real imagery, but a lot of made up, like collectibles and background information. They made up gods. So this is really cool to actually see very true to life imagery, but though albeit mixed together. And you'll see this for anyone who's really into Egyptology. You'll find that they mix up the different time periods. Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom stuff will all be together all at once. So the next one, this image on some of these walls of these three women was actually quite a big mystery to me, and actually found the source of it through the Tomb Raider Art Encyclopedia. So it's a credit to Tom B. Raider 900, who ran a website where he attempted to a similar project with the original non-remastered games. Though it doesn't seem like he's as active in 2019, so there are some elements that will be similar, but there are also many elements that I've been trying to add to make it more variety and with my background, my knowledge as well. And but yeah, all credit to him for identifying this as the tomb stela of Tatshep Khonsu. So it's a late period. It's in the Egyptian Museum of Berlin today, and this is actually the deceased individual greeting in the larger stela, greeting five deities that are cut out. So if you see the two figures in the middle, couple of the figures in the back and in the middle, Ra and Horus, leaving just the only Isis and Nephthys here in the game. And also, I think they repeat one of the female deities instead. So there's a bit of manipulating of the art. So the Bastet statue that I mentioned, the cat statue that was in sort of that alcove area in the game, in this part of the level, is actually a large Bastet statue from the late period from Saqqara in Egypt. It's currently at the British Museum. It's been called the Anderson cat, and there's also a copy of it in the Cairo Museum. Sorry, in the Geir Anderson Museum in Cairo. Also, this one is actually quite interesting because I don't think I've ever seen anything like this, and this is not something that you see discussed very often. But these sculptures, when you go into this area where you start swimming underneath the water, this is actually a series of images of a bee. And if you're interested in beekeeping in ancient Egypt, some very narrow, specific kind of area of ancient Egypt, of course, but also something that I think nobody really talks about. And here's a book by Jean Kritsky that might be interesting to read about. Now, the next one is the plaque of King Amenemhet, or IV, giving an offering to Atum, the deity. It's from the Middle Egyptian period in Byblos, or Phoenicia, in Lebanon, but is currently located in the British Museum. Here's the description from the British Museum on this if you're interested in pausing and reading more about it. So this one is a mural painting from the tomb of Seti I, and there's a copy in the British Museum. You can see on the left, and another by Belzoni, the Italian circus strongman who spent a good chunk of his life also moving and taking monuments from Egypt. So he's also made a drawing of it, and yeah, it's mirrored in the game though, interestingly enough. This one, right underneath that statue with the disc and the two ure, you actually have this platform area, and I'd always thought it was just kind of a ephemeral kind of little square to elevate the statue here, but if the Tomb Raider Art Encyclopedia is correct, and all credit to them if it is, this does to some extent resemble a 12th dynasty Egyptian coffin, Middle Egyptian coffin. There's another example that I found in the game, the top right-hand corner, that looks a little bit more like a Middle Egyptian coffin than the example on the left. But yeah, what's really important is that this type of coffin, these rectangular boxes with all these hieroglyphs around it and the two eyes, those are very specifically Middle Egyptian style coffins. The more kind of painted anthropomorphic coffins that you might see in later Egypt, where you have really clear paintings or they're created in the form of the individual, that comes more in the New Kingdom period. So it is very diagnostic, if it indeed is referring to one, at least the left one. The top one on top right, just to be clear, is very much a Middle Egyptian coffin represented. This one's kind of fun because it is actually playing off of, I guess, playing off of the false door design that's present in Egyptian iconography and also wall architecture. Sometimes you have this like or opening like designs that are not actual real doors or entrances, but they kind of represent it. Sometimes they represent palace entrances. Sometimes they're much more generally several different types. There's several different types of false door motifs that are present. But in this case, in the game, you can actually use it to open it, or even I think in one case it's basically a switch that allows you to open a switch, and in another case it's used as an actual door itself. So it is a bit of a little in joke for whoever designed this section of the level. So, and as you enter this room, you have several different things that are all actual real life objects. So here in the center is actually a representation of Tutankhamun's Senate board, and it's very much his Senate board because if you look at the design, the top, the way that its legs are shaped with those animal feet with the almost like little ski bottoms there. The only difference, it is very diagnostic, but it's very different from the actual Senate board of Tutankhamun in the sheer scale of it. This one's the size of like a foosball table or an air hockey table almost, but in real life it would have been much smaller. Right? It would have been maybe just a little bit bigger than let's say, well, it's a rough estimate, but let's say imagine like a small tiny chess board, just be much more portable. Though in some iconography you do see much larger Senate boards as well. But that's not the only thing. The chairs on the sides as well. Oh, before I go over to that one, the Senate is, so here's a bigger version of the Senate board, but also how you would progress throughout the game, right? 1 to 30. And in later example, you also have these things called stick dice. So you throw these instead of using dice, you throw these into the air. And the objective of the game is sort of to race to the end. And in later period, there were more symbolic elements to it, as you can see based off of some of the images on the different tiles. And you can play Senate if you're interested in finding an app. I'm not in any way sponsored by anyone. This is just a Senate version I tried when I was playing. It's pretty fun, and it's the Senate game is also something that is referenced in the Last Revelation, but it's not the same game. Even though it's called that in that level, it's actually the game of 20 squares. So if you play Tomb Raider Revelation, you might have heard of Senate, but that game is actually a very different game where you have two people on both sides. So if you look at the bottom here, there are 3 rows on the left hand side, right? And so the center row is where you and the person that you're facing would race to the edge, and you would have those 4 squares on one side for yourself, and you had a row of 4 squares on the other side for the other person, and you basically roll your dice or throw your stick dice, and you would try to race all the way around and to the exit here. So, and this is actually a descendant from the royal game of in Mesopotamia, which uses some of the earliest dice that have ever been found in the archaeological record. I believe only the Indus Valley civilization has rivaling examples of early dice, if you're just in ancient gaming. And that said, a lot of Senate boards do have the game of 20 squares on the bottom, so at least a few examples do. So both games would have been played in ancient Egypt. Moving on to the chairs, though, these are actually copies of Queen Hetepheres I's armchair, and they are located in the Cairo Museum. Her tomb was located in Giza itself. So some of the smaller tombs that you see near the Great Pyramids of Giza, one of them is her tomb. So, and she's also the wife of Snefre of the bent and red pyramids, and the mother of Khufu, who built the Great Pyramid of Giza. And I'll also talk more about the pyramids of Giza when I move on to the Great Circle, my Great Circle video as well soon. This one, I have no idea what this is. This looks more like a modern glass case. So if there is anything resembling that, do let me know, but I'm pretty sure it's a much later bit of maybe 19th century furniture or something that's just placed here. Okay, so in both this one and the anniversary edition, you do have multiple amulets. They actually look a little different when you pick them up and when you see them sometimes when you pick them up, you have the icon that spins around in front of you to show you what you picked up. Those can look a little slightly different here. So, for example, the scarab has this kind of reddish dot for eyes that is not in the actual one. So these are all actual amulet styles that you'd find in ancient Egypt, and I'll go through them one by one. And it's something that is in the remastered, the anniversary editions, and with slight changes to the design. and they are all actually all very symbolic. And in the anniversary edition, is you can see they're all you place once you find them, you place them into these false door designs. Again, you have this kind of false door shape used as a motif in the level. Okay, so Eye of Horus. Here's an almost exact example of that. At least the anniversary edition, more specifically, looks like this one, and it's from the British Museum. And the Ankh also has an example in the British Museum that's almost a one-to-one, so probably that's the one that it's based off of. And the Ankh, of course, is something that you've probably seen in a lot of ancient Egypt themed stories or movies or games. And it is a very rare type of amulet, and in the type of form that you see in the game, this is not just an amulet, it's very much a scepter with several different major Egyptian symbols stacked on top of it. So as you can see, it has the Ankh shape with the knot of reeds and like the hook and the cross. But you also have this almost thing that looks like, what do you call those things? Those honey dippers, where you have these ridges on the top of that end, the upper end. That one's actually known as the jet. It's symbolic of stability, and it's representative of the pillar that was cut from a sacred tree that wrapped around the body of Osiris. So when Osiris was killed by Set and then tossed away, he tossed into a body of water, he flowed and then became a part of a tree that was then cut down and used as a pillar. And in order to free Osiris, Isis found that location and had him cut out. So that it's representative of stability. It's sometimes also represented by kind of the spine of a cow as well, I believe. But then on top of those two symbols, you have this little hook design, this hooked staff, and that's actually another scepter or staff that you do see in Egyptian iconography. On the right-hand side, I have a very kind of unique example. It's almost like a stick figure. That you will see multiple deities that do hold this staff, and that's the was symbol, representing dominion. So you have together in one scepter, life, stability, and dominion all together. And on the bottom left, I have an example from the Met Museum where you have the same three symbols grouped together in another sculpture. And in terms of actually the use of Ankh amulets or scepters, we again don't have too many real life examples, but the iconography does show pharaohs and deities using them, holding them. And so here's an example of Horus blessing Ramesses II with an Ankh. This example was cut and moved to the Louvre Museum currently, if you'd like to see that. Now, scarab amulets, on the other hand, are much more common, and they could be made mass-produced almost, depending on the time period. And here are some examples of scarabs in the British Museum, and including one colossal version of it that's less an amulet, more like a statue. And so they are more abundant, and they do seem to also be the base of another one of the amulets, the seal of Anubis here, for example. And they differ in the anniversary edition and the remastered or the original editions in terms of the amount of writing that you see on the back. So these seals are probably the backs of scarab amulets as well. So some scarabs only had the royal names of pharaohs or officials, and they sometimes act as kind of seals that you would use to stamp with. They might also be found in burials. So on the top left side, you have this funerary heart scarab from the British Museum. They could also be commemorative or memorial scarabs that are produced by the hundreds by pharaohs to disseminate announcements of events. So let's say one example would be the marriage of Amenhotep III. When that event occurred, he used scarabs with writing to announce it and just kind of pass them out, or send them out, rather. You also have a variant of the Ankh being used as well, a more simple version of that. So that's used as the Ankh key, as opposed to the amulets I mentioned. And these ones, it could again represent Ankh amulets, of course. So here's another simplified version of just the Ankh itself, where you have a green glazed ceramic Ankh amulet from the British Museum for comparison. But you also can find Ankh-shaped objects such as this mirror case from King Tut's tomb as well. Moving forward through the next section of the level, you find more of these walls of all cartouches. This would not actually be something that you would find in Egyptian sites, except for, well, generally you wouldn't find it like this. There is a king list, and I'm blanking on the exact site, but there is at least one site where you have kind of king lists on the walls, but not really like this at all. But again, an opportunity for anybody interested in reading Egyptian or looking up cartouches. You certainly can spend a whole afternoon looking them up. But you do also have, and probably quite fun, I might actually do that myself when I have more time. But on the right-hand side, you can see that there's also a large coffin in this room, and it is actually a possibly a real life coffin. Most likely it is based off of a real one, given the track record in this game. The closest one I could find is this mummy coffin of a middle-aged man named Hor, and it's inscribed with his name on it, and it has that sort of similar winged design almost. But except at the bottom it doesn't have inscriptions so much as more images being depicted. So it's not exactly the same one, but it's very similar, and it's from the third intermediate period. So the intermediate periods contrast with the early, middle, and New Kingdom periods. Sorry, old, middle, and New Kingdom periods by being the kind of periods in between that were more of turmoil and where there were fewer clear instances of a one single royal dynasty ruling over Egypt. So there might be multiple competing claims to the throne or active kind of polities in the area. These ones I generally weren't quite sure of the exact real-life origins. On the left-hand side, I believe that's Tefnut and Shu. On the top right hand, I'm not quite sure. And the bottom has this vessel. And I am, again, not an Egyptologist, so this ceramic type, I wouldn't know what time period it is or what the context isn't from, unfortunately. So this one on the right-hand side, you actually see this scene used multiple times throughout the game in, I think, halls as well as in this kind of almost altar area where you pick up the Ankh key, and it's actually from the scene of a scene of Hanifer, the deceased individual, and a deceased individual led to his judgment by Anubis. So where Anubis goes and weighs his heart with the feather of Ma'at to decide whether he is worthy or whether he's to be devoured. So this is from the Book of the Dead of Hanifer from the 19th dynasty in Thebes, Egypt, and it is found in the British Museum today. But in certain cases, they just sort of take from the top upper left register, and sometimes even cut it only to the deity sitting in front of Hanifer himself on the top left-hand corner. So this one is actually a ceiling design of all things. So this is used for a wall, but this is actually a ceiling design of the Nekbet vulture at Philae. And the Nekbet is one of the earliest figures supernatural figures that existed well before even the founding of the Old Kingdom. And then moving on to the next section, this is where you're moving towards that final part of that level of this level, and it's actually quite interesting. These two gigantic statues, one seems to be of Anubis, much more clearly a jackal on the right hand side, but on the left, not as clear because there are more than one falcon-headed god. There is more than one falcon-headed god. We often think of Horus, but there's also Montu and Ra and Khonsu as well. So I've placed through references on the bottom if you're interested. The different headdresses specifically would help indicate which falcon-headed deity that we're talking about. But interestingly, the statue does not have any, so it would be hard to say exactly who. Like here's an example of a life-size statue of Horemheb, the pharaoh Horemheb, and with Horus, who does have headdress on top to identify him, and this one's from Vienna. So, and they're both seated in a similar position, but yeah, the only closest statues of this size, I would say, would famously be the Colossi of Memnon. So both are seated statues of the pharaoh Amenhotep III, flanking the entrance to his mortuary temple. So this, I think, would be of a similar scale to what we're talking about in the game, but not the same figures. As you can see there's a horse and also people at the bottom just to show you the sheer scale of some of these statues. Okay, and then finally we are in this little hall that it's completely transformed in the Anniversary Edition, but this sort of is just repeating of the same motifs that we saw before. And again, if you see at the bottom here, and again I know the Tomb Raider Art Encyclopedia called this type of design reminiscent of the Middle Egyptian coffins, and I guess it is sort of does take inspiration from it, but it's obviously in this context it's not being that so much as just being used. The similar line designs are being used, column designs are being used for platforms and edge designs. I don't think that they're actual Egyptian designs otherwise that are like this architecturally. But yeah, in the Anniversary Edition I'll talk more about it. Some of these pillars even though they're rectangular in the game here, they do resemble the designs on the Great Hypostyle Hall at the Temple of Karnak. And this will be more readily apparent in the Anniversary Edition when they revise and I'll show you right now anyways. So yeah, then we lead to the end of the level, and then we will go on to the anniversary edition. A lot of the same ideas. This one, I'm not quite sure. It's been modified a lot, right? You have all these rectangular. I'm not really sure what they're trying to represent. I guess they're supposed to represent that it's made out of different stone blocks. You have winged scarabs as well, so which are found as amulets, but these are turned into switches in the game. Okay, this one. Next design that you might see. So what the anniversary edition did, whether you like the anniversary edition or not, it is they did add a few more different motifs to, I guess, give it a little bit more variety, which is pretty cool. You have this image of Ptolemy the Eighth and Soap in front of Sobek, and this is from the Ombo Temple. So it is. We also have images of Ptolemy the Eighth with Khonsu as well. And so Ptolemaic period, when the Macedonian Greeks were in charge, they built, Ptolemy the Eighth built this temple, and it actually has over 300 crocodile mummies that were found here as well. So, and they are on display, these mummified crocodiles. So it's pretty amazing, also pretty freaky in its own way to actually find 300 crocodiles to mummify. Really. Also, again, you have also from Temple of Kolombo, you have this imagery of the coronation scene of Ptolemy the Ninth, and yeah, you have him in front of Sobek and also in front of Ra, I believe, and you can see him with the double crown of unified Egypt, of the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt, and there's basically no real surviving example of these crowns, unfortunately, archaeologically. So I know if you're familiar with the famous Bob Breyer, who did the great courses lectures on in Egypt, albeit in the 1990s now. Yeah, his idea, he did have this idea that maybe they were just very rare because they were passed down. So if it's such an important crown, it might have not had many different versions or copies, right? You just use the same one as that sacred symbol. Though I haven't read enough to see what there's much more ongoing literature about that. Now, also just a clarification on the coronation scene itself. So what's very notable about this scene is that in the Ptolemaic period, two of the primordial figures in the pre-Hellenistic period, the Nekbet, the vulture goddess that we mentioned earlier, that's on one of the lintels, and also the Wajet, which later becomes the Uraeus, the snake that you find often on crowns and also on other designs. They actually become two anthropomorphic figures. So, and in this crowning of this Ptolemaic pharaoh, you have Nekbet with the crown of Upper Egypt and the human version of Wajet with the lower crown of Egypt. So together, crowning the Ptolemaic pharaoh represents that kind of joining of Upper and Lower Egypt. And so this is actually also a very common thing. If you look at the front of some headdresses, crowns, you will see kind of two figures representing both the Wajet and the Nekbet. And here again, for reference, you have the different falcon-headed gods and the different headdresses that indicate who they are. Yeah, so moving into that major section where in the remastered and the original editions, you had this sphinx, this giant sphinx in it. In the anniversary edition, they changed it to a central pool with an obelisk in the center. And again, you have the coronation scenes in the background from Colombo. And the actual singular obelisks in the center are actually not accurate in terms of ancient Egyptian contexts, but more so in the later Roman and also more modern European examples when they were brought over to different countries in Europe, and also in at least one case in the US, in Central Park. So yeah, so obelisks really come in pairs, and they're placed in front of temples by the entrance. Single obelisks are more of a monument from later removal and reinstallation, and fundamentally they're very different from how we think of obelisks today. So think of it as like obelisks in the original context as framing a temple, versus in Roman context and in more later European, even current day locations of where those obelisks are, the obelisks themselves have become kind of a central monument as they are in this game. So, and here is an example of the Luxor Temple. And so on the left-hand side, you have an older drawing of the two obelisks in front of the remains of the temple. And on the upper right, you have what it looks like currently with the single obelisk on the left-hand side, the right one now being moved to another location in Europe. I believe this is in France. And again, the sphinxes in this level are really larger than all sphinxes except maybe the Great Sphinx of Giza. As far as I know. There's another sphinx that is of this scale. I have in the comments. So in the center, you actually have an areas for the Ankh keys, but you also have these water lilies, which are featured regularly in ancient Egyptian iconography, many contexts, and may have also been used as a mild hallucinogen, particularly, I believe, the blue water lily. And that is something that has seen a few studies modern times in terms of their pharmacology as well. So, underexplored area of ancient Egyptian society, but does exist and does have peer-reviewed articles on their on their effects. Sometimes they can be quite strong and kind of, if you read up on them, it's actually quite freaky what happens to some people who use them. Anyways, so yeah, and here's an example from the Amarna Palace paintings that are now in the Brooklyn Museum of Art in the US. This frieze on the right-hand side, I can't really figure out where it originates from, but if anybody's interested, it's also underneath the... It's actually basically a replication of the what I showed you earlier with the winged sun with the other figures, but they look very different in the anniversary edition. And instead of becoming a little lintel area, it's a massive lintel now. And it's clearly been modified, so I'm not quite sure if they're really keeping the same... It's the same inspiration, but I'm not sure if they found like bigger examples of it from a different time period and different site instead, because they do look a little different, even though they have the same theme of showing the deities in a procession and the winged disc above. Okay, so again you have a procession of Anubis, Horus, Osiris, and I believe, please correct me if I'm wrong, I'll double check this later, or correct me if I believe it should be Isis and Nephthys in the back. I have no idea again what the original context of this is, unfortunately. And in the anniversary edition now you also have this very massive hallway of moving seated pharaohs, basically. And again, this is very much reminiscent of the seated figure of Ramesses II at Abu Simbel, which really frames this entire level at the beginning. But in this kind of hall where you have two rows of facing pharaohs, that is actually something that is more of the interior, representative of the interior of Abu Simbel. And this is an earlier painting when they were still buried. And so it's sort of a mixing of ideas of the interior and the exterior, but instead of using standing statues of pharaohs, they're using the image of Ramesses II almost, in seated figures facing one another instead. Interesting though that at the bottom of these pharaohs you actually have another design, but it's not really clear where it comes from. I think it sort of looks like the opening of the mouth ceremony for King Tut, but it's not quite the same. So the winged disc design actually continues and comes back again, this time with the winged beetle instead, the winged scarab. So kind of nice juxtaposition. Though obviously something that's manufactured for the game, because it is more of a sliding gate here. There's some designs here, scenes that I also can't figure out what they are. So perhaps somebody can zoom in and take a look, because they're very fragmented. You can see that the artists the game designers purposely flick chunks off in order to kind of give it that ruined quality. Again, we have another false door design. This one actually a kind of full false door, and with a comparison here from the door of Neferu from the Old Kingdom, and that's at the Met Museum. So actually I think the example from Neferu is actually something that will come back later, because the two individuals at the bottom do appear in this level, even though I haven't been able to identify the exact false door that's seen in this part of the level, which is more inscriptions than... Though they appear to be repeated designs, so I'm not quite sure if that one's based off of something real, if they just kind of copied some hieroglyphs and repeated the design. So for this one's in that pool of water where you have multiple levels that you have to climb, pushing the blocks and trying to open the door, the opening in the ceiling. And this one actually is the exact same image. I found the original. The colors have been manipulated a bit by the game designer, or the artist. So this comes from the tomb of Neferhotep, and these are boats of mourners and provisions for the dead, in the act of in the funerary rite for burying them. This box in the same room that you push around in order to get the upper levels is actually a real object. As you can see, it does have the same eye design like the Middle Egyptian coffins that I mentioned earlier in the video. It's the same kind of diagnostic pattern of designs of glyphs as the Middle Egyptian coffin, but these are for canopic jars instead, so to hold some of the organs of two brothers who were high status priests. And this box is actually in the Manchester Museum in the UK. Again, we have the Geir Anderson cat, but now this time it's several times larger than before, and it's, I think, much bigger than Lara herself. It's in front of this giant pool, but essentially the location of the pillars are roughly in the same positions, but they've almost exclusively used rounded pillars for this level now in the Anniversary Edition. So in this section, you see more of the placement of obelisks in every location, not more than just putting them as one single kind of monument, but also as kind of decorations or pieces in almost every room, so many of the rooms in this level. So this one is actually can't really identify the exact obelisk, but in the back we see these sort of rounded pillars with the very distinct shapes at the top, kind of grooved shapes that are carved into them. This is actually something that resembles what we found at the second Peristyle Hall in the Memphite tomb of Horemheb in Saqqara, and this is not actually his tomb, but rather built when he was commander-in-chief of Egypt's army under King Tut. And so, but instead of having it as sort of this open kind of courtyard area, they're kind of recessed into the back walls of this room. So really taking it but adjusting it for this more cavernous looking level area. There's also this image of what seems to be a pharaoh and Isis, and I can't identify the exact one, and it could, I think, theoretically it might be possible if one could match the cartouches in the back. They're not very high quality, so, but if anybody can read them, you could probably identify the name if it's an actual cartouche. But the relationship between the pharaoh and Isis is found in other contexts too, among different kings. So here's an example of Seti I in the lap of Isis on the right hand side. In this next area, you have the repeated design of Seti I, Khnum, the ram-headed god on the left hand side, of the god of fertility that also created humans and some deities on a potter's wheel. And you have Seti I, the pharaoh, in the middle, and then you have the god Amun on the right hand side. And this is found at his mortuary temple at Abydos. And here's an example of Khnum, the ram-headed god, fashioning an individual out of clay on a potter's wheel from the Indara temple. So not a god that's very common in popular culture, but certainly present in this level, which is pretty cool. So this is the tomb of Nefertari, the sky vault ceiling with the pillar showing Osiris on the left hand side, and the right hand side being the game's version of that. I believe there might be other examples elsewhere, and actually we'll talk more a bit about that at the end of the level. You have something similar, night sky scene on the ceiling as well. I just figure I couldn't really identify who they were, so if anybody knows a lot about maybe carved reliefs in Egypt, maybe you could have more of a lead on that. But then next you have this scarab switch, which is very creative because you have the scarab with the dung ball and with his wings opening, moving away towards this kind of ray effect that's being created by the multiple lines at the top of that switch. And so that's of course referencing how one of the ideas about how the sun rose above the sky is that you had a scarab pushing it up across and into the sky. And it's actually an interesting thing because it'll be contrasted with something else related to the day and night cycles at the end of the level. And then I'll talk a little bit more about a few more examples of real life examples of this winged dung beetle with the ball being the sun at the top here. In a few cases, one from the Met Museum at the bottom left, a small amulet. On the right-hand side, you have multiple different pieces made out of gold in King Tut's tomb. Here's another example. This is actually much closer, this design on this door is much closer to what you see in this piece from Tutankhamun's tomb. Again, more juxtaposition of obelisks with the winged scarab with the sun design, I believe Ra in the background, and a few other characters, possibly Isis, throughout this area of the level. Here's another view. I'm having some trouble identifying all the figures in this. Here's more of them. Another figure of a male individual, and there's a few kind of hieroglyphs being placed here. And there's also another image of Osiris with two figures behind him, which I believe should be Horus and Isis, so his son and his wife, in front of maybe the pharaoh providing offerings of two vessels in front of him, which is a pattern that we do see repeatedly in this level itself. So there's this kind of repeated logic that's present in something that is also repeated, of course, in Egyptian iconography and more repeated offerings, or figures holding offerings again, not just the bases of these obelisks, which of course is not how these designs and also these objects would be used. So how these obelisks would be used in real life, of course. And also in this part of the level, behind one of the blocks, you can find a cat mummy. And this is similar to some of the ones that are found in the British Museum, and also one that is featured in one of the recent previews of Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. And this one's in that giant room with the central obelisk where you put in the different amulets or to kind of lower the different walkways. And it's a very complicated scene. It seems to still be a funerary scene of the preparation of the mummy, the weighing of the individual, but sort of looks to be a series of processionary scenes showing the dead facing the scales of fate, greeting the gods. Again, very similar to the same stuff that we've been seeing throughout the level. Very much keeping to those scenes of funerary reliefs of different tombs. Although it's sort of I guess this is technically a giant tomb in many ways, but it's from an archaeologist perspective. You're having a lot of different things meshed together at once. Anyways, and here's a scene where you find Anubis on top of a mummy, so part of mummification preparation process, where it seems to be the case that some of the priests or the specialists involved in mummifying the dead would also maybe have a kind of a mask or a headdress of Anubis as they participate in the preparations of it. As you can see at the bottom of the mummy itself, you find two posts. So you can see this better on the funerary couch. There's actually part of the funerary couch where you could place the mummy itself during preparation. And it seems to be the closest example I found is this one, the tomb of the artist Sennacherib in the 19th dynasty of Thebes. Though this is a scene that is present in many different tombs. So here's another example from Deir el-Medina, the bottom left here. Similar, but it seems the tomb of Sennacherib is a lot closer. And actually, there's actually a 3D tour of the tomb of Sennacherib if you're interested. There are actually a bunch of these since the pandemic. A lot of cultural institutions in Egypt and also outside of Egypt have made these available in lieu of being able to actually visit the sites during that time period. As you climb upwards in this area, you do find the motif of these two figures, seemingly either holding a staff or in front of a very narrow slit. And that seems to be kind of I can't know for sure, but the closest one I could find is, again, from the mastaba of the Old Kingdom in Saqqara, and it's now at the Met Museum again, of course. But if you look at the two figures at the center of this false door design, you see two figures in very similar positions. So it's possible that they kind of enlarged a false door design, narrowed the slit of the doorway itself, and kind of adjusted the colors to make it look like kind of these, I guess, to make it look like false doors in the game itself, painted onto the walls instead. So, and again, just for clarification, a mastaba is one of the predecessors forms of tombs before the building of pyramids. Kind of earlier, before pyramids were built, you had kind of single structures rather than the stacked pyramids that you'd see at Saqqara, and then later the smoother pyramids that you'd find at Giza. Some more imagery that's a lot harder to identify. Again, you see the one on the right at least, and maybe Horus? No, or Ra. It's a little hard to see. Okay, but later on you do have this giant beautiful mural that you actually have to swing across and walk around swinging with your boots on, of course, as Lara. And this is actually a real mural, not as big as the games. The games version is an amazing, beautiful mural. In reality, it is still a beautiful mural, but it's much smaller. And it's from the Tomb of Horemheb, KB 57, again, one of the later successors of King Tut after the priest, the vizier Ai, took over after Tut's death. Horemheb came in formally as the commander-in-chief of the army to take over. And yeah, so a very major tomb in the New Kingdom period, especially at the end of the Amarna, after the influence of the pharaohs of the Amarna period. Akhenaten tried to make Aten the new sun god, this new monotheistic deity, and Horemheb actually spent a lot of time erasing traces of the previous pharaohs, of Tut, of Ai, of Akhenaten, of course. And yeah, it's got the star pattern. If you see at the top of the roof of this room, you can see the star pattern again that we saw elsewhere in this level, but we also see the main figures that are present. You have Osiris in white on the left-hand side in the actual image that I have, and then you have Horemheb himself in between Osiris and Hathor, and in the center, the woman in the center, you have Horemheb in front of her, and then you have Isis on the right-hand side in front of another image of Horemheb with Horus all the way on the far right. So in the game, it actually flip it backwards. So from left to right on the game version, on the left-hand side, you have Horus, you have Horemheb, you have Isis, then you have Horemheb again in the center, then you have Hathor, and then you have Osiris on the right hand side. And here's an image of where it's located. So it's a long kind of single axis tomb with several staircases going downwards. This is actually right in the middle of the tomb, of the pathway of the tomb into the burial chamber at the bottom. And here's a picture of the actual burial chamber itself in the back here at the bottom. Kind of the state at which it was found, at least found when it could be photographed, of course, in the 19th century. So yeah, so just to give you more context of the tomb itself, so there's religious text from the late dynasty, describing the journey of the sun god through the 12 gates of the netherworld in this tomb as well, which is pretty cool. More figures that couldn't really quite identify, but they're of either a single one repeated multiple times, it seems. It actually looks like one of the other figures that you see in this video, the deceased individual facing multiple gods, but except it's isolating the deceased individual alone and repeating it multiple times as a pattern. Okay, and here's more of that room with a single obelisk. So I didn't actually find real-life archaeological versions of these, except for the one of Horus here at the bottom, but the other ones of Thoth. So he's the ibis, the one with the ibis head instead of the falcon head, and he has this moon crown sometimes on top. And these are actually art pieces, like kind of more touristy or artistic representations of him instead. So it's possible it's based off of something real, or a real frieze on a temple, but I couldn't identify one that quite has the same raised carved design. Okay, this one I think we talked about. This is from another one from Kom Ombo. This one I couldn't really identify either. It's a little too faint, but it does appear to be a pharaoh with only the lower crown of Egypt. You don't see that pointed. So if you look at in front of the pharaoh with the crown, you see a guy with a pointy crown. That again is Osiris, and his crown is more the crown of Upper Egypt, as I mentioned earlier. So a pharaoh only of the lower crown of Egypt, holding what appear to be two vessels in front of Osiris, who is seated, and behind him you have, it should be Isis, followed by Horus in the back. So you have that repeated pattern, very formulaic, but very important. So unfortunately, I really can't figure out what the original is from this one. It really is, of course, modified from whatever original inspiration is from, because of just how they added this wear effect, made the lines a little fainter, overlaid it with the brick design, the stone design on top or underneath. Here we actually have two references once more to the King Tut. In the foreground you have a statue of Anubis, and in the background you actually have King Tut himself in a hunting scene. There's also a hunting or warfare scene, because the original has two sides to it. It's from a wooden chest. On the first side you have King Tut riding a chariot with soldiers leading soldiers into battle against an army from the east. And this one's in the Cairo Museum. If you note the circular fan at his elbow, that's held aloft to pull back on the bow, that's the exact same as are some of the placement of the horse and the bird design on the above him. And so you can also see that he's wearing the blue crown, or the war crown of the Keprish. This is, of course, from the New Kingdom period. But on the other side, you also have a scene of him hunting instead. So the scene could be, it's hard to know exactly which side it's referring to, but it does refer to the same object. The Anubis statue of the Anubis shrine is also very accurate, almost a one-to-one representation in the game to the one found in King Tut's tomb. So yeah, here's another view of it on a palanquin, so that it could be carried by 4 people. It's actually pretty decently big and pretty much the same size as it is in the game. So I couldn't find an exact one-to-one real-life version of this one on the left-hand side, but I did find something which is from the tomb of Amenemhet in the Middle Egyptian period. This one, not quite sure where it comes from, unfortunately. But yeah, it does seem to be a pharaoh, being walked by a couple of deities. I think Osiris on the right-hand side. The left-hand side, the headdress is really kind of not very clear, so yeah, it could be Ra, could be Horus. Really hard to see, unfortunately. In this big room, you have 4 different little mini obelisks on top of these pedestals with images of figures holding up offerings. And these ones can't really say where they come from individually, because they're very much cut out from larger scenes and just reused as a motif, it seems. Again, the exact version of this one is unclear, but it does look like that earlier image of Osiris, Isis, and Nephthys in front of one of the deceased individuals that we talked about earlier. Again, the game's design of these giant sphinxes is absolutely beautiful, but not something that you'd find in real life, unfortunately, at least at this scale. You'd use sphinxes, just this is kind of much more maximalist than any known surviving statue of a sphinx. Again, cross-comparing the two sphinxes I mentioned earlier. So in this room, we actually have pyramidions on top of obelisks, so kind of artificially juxtaposed together, but pyramidions were the limestone caps on the tops of the pyramids. And so and I think like they took it from this modern example of a pyramidion on display at the Red Pyramid of Dashur, where they just put it on a pedestal. I guess they just turned it into an obelisk. And yeah, pyramidions are also sometimes thought to represent the Benben mound. So the Benben mound is a primordial mound that arose in the origins of Egyptian mythological stories, and is also sort of one of the possible and symbolic influences on the development of pyramids in the region. Again, we sort of have these scenes that are isolated of people with offerings. So this one's not the same, but for comparison, here's a kneeling attendant presenting presents and offerings at the temple of Seti I at Abydos. And note the very similar looking sputtered vessels. This one actually was also edited, so it very much seems to be the case that in the anniversary edition, they use a lot of the real iconography, real imagery, real objects, but in some cases they really modified the art a bit. Unless I'm wrong and there's another scene that does have this exact image. On the left-hand side, as you can see, that there's Anubis and I believe Horus with Ramesses cartouche in the center, whereas in the original that I found at least, you have Horus and Anubis in front of the actual human figure of Ramesses I, and then you have the same cartouche on the top right that's circled in black here. So instead they just transplanted it into the center. I'm not quite sure why, maybe it just seems to give off the impression that's more like a door if you have maybe just the two cartouches to kind of make it more symmetrical with the two Ankh keys at this gate and Anubis and Horus flanked. Maybe. So again, almost an exact or very similar to the original. Again, you have Anubis and you have the falcon-headed figure that could be Horus, could be Ra. Again, because without the headdress, I'm assuming that they designed it without the headdress to make it more symmetrical looking in the level. Again, for comparison, Anubis though has switched positions, as you can see. In the anniversary edition, he's on the left-hand side, whereas in the original, he's on the right-hand side. So, and also above this pool, we actually have three figures and statues. This looks very familiar, but I can't place it right now, at least. There are also additional designs between the two statues in the anniversary edition that have been added. It just looks like a big mix of different murals and hieroglyphs and just symbols. So kind of hard to interpret from that, unfortunately. And it's also very difficult to get a good picture because of how narrow this area is. And then finally, we enter that spot right before you pick up the next piece, and you have these pillars. But these are now very clearly pillars that resemble those at Karnak and Luxor. Instead, the Great Hypostyle here, hall at Karnak here looks very much like it, except it's not in the same kind of gold painted look that you see in the game. And here's the Grand Colonnade in the Luxor Temple, which is also very similar. Could be another influence to it. And here's some close-ups of the scenes. I haven't been able to cross-compare scenes and the writing on the Temple of Karnak and at Luxor for comparison to see if they're actually copying pieces or images or scenes from those two sites, or whether they're just tacking on assorted motifs that they had. So some more of that, and then Laura's off to the next location and into the next tree. But before we go, we also again have the winged disc with the two uraei, as well as another image of Osiris with Isis and this again. And then you have on the ceiling, you actually have a very real life ceiling from the tomb of Ramses VI. You can see how it's one singular line all the way to the tomb, with a variety of different waypoints that you stop before you get to the end there. And so it's an astronomical ceiling with Nut and scenes from the books of heaven. So Nut is the goddess that whose body reaches across the sky and forms the night sky that way. And so mythologically speaking, every night she would spread across the sky. So there are several different ideas about deities and the night sky and the rising of the sun that are not always coherent. If you read a bit about ancient Egypt, right, sometimes you have Ra going across the sky and then not following, and in other cases you have the scarab pushing the sun across the sky. Ancient Egyptian religion mythology isn't always consistent. It's important to point that out. And then finally we have Lara having a vision on top of this pyramid of Qualo and Natla and the third guy that I forget, Tehoken. Yeah, so about half of this pyramid, it's kind of strange because you have this Olmec head from San Lorenzo in Mexico City. So again, maybe it's supposed to reference kind of this Atlantis, maybe it's supposed to reference another third location. But yeah, it's kind of just oddly placed here. It's not really quite where Olmec heads would be placed. It also seems to have a neck and a body, which is very different. And certainly not something that we do find. It's something we do not find. It is something that we don't find in the archaeological record. Okay, so that's about it. Here are some of the cartouches and hieroglyphs, in case anyone wants to try to match them up. Here's one, another one. Okay. Oh, and also, finally, just interesting point. Most of these underground areas, or these rock cut areas, aren't actually something that you'd find on the same scale in Egypt, except maybe at Abu Simbel. And also, in terms of underground spaces, probably the close matching in terms of sheer scale would be KV5. This is in the Valley of the Kings, but it's also interestingly featured in Last Revelation. So I'll go through more of this tomb when we get to that. But you can see that it's a whole complex of spaces for Ramesses II's sons. And so here's an image of two of the archaeologists who investigated it, and it's still an ongoing kind of clearing process. So could take who knows decades before it is fully investigated and documented. And it's also always at the threat of collapse as well. So as you can see, even in this picture, there's a lot of rubble all around them. Thanks again, everyone. So hope you enjoyed it this time. Sorry, I started to run out of breath at the end there. I'm probably going to switch around to doing some stuff for the Indiana Jones series before coming back to Tomb Raider, especially as the Great Circle is starting to really pick up steam and terms of previews that we're getting to see and the game release itself. So can't wait for that to happen. Anyways, see you next time.